Okay, so we're up and running, we're recording. Welcome to those of you that joined the webinar, and welcome to those viewing online too. We have Stuart Armstrong with us today, who will be leading the main bulk of the webinar regarding the future direction of the coaching plan for England and the CSP role within the coaching strand of work too. Just to give a little bit of context before we go into it, we thought it would be useful to provide this to you today, given the comms that have been released by Sport England regarding the new coaching direction for CSPs, the submissions that CSPs are going through now for how they will develop a local framework for the next 6 months, and also plans for periods from April 2018 onwards. So Stuart's kindly agreed to do this today, to share those thoughts with you and get your input too, in terms of questions that have been submitted beforehand, which Stuart has seen, and any questions you might have today as well. So I think that's more or less everything. I will pass you over to Stuart, who, as I say, will lead the bulk of this webinar. Okay, so over to you, Stuart.
Thank you, Lee. I'm assuming everybody can hear me. And thanks everybody for dialing in or logging in to the webinar. It's a great opportunity for me to obviously chat to all of you and let you know what's going on. I suppose a couple of quick things just to say from the starting point is I'm hoping to, as much as possible, to cover as many of the questions certainly that you've submitted, and also anything that you might want to ask me as we go through the process. And I'm obviously going to be, as I always try to be, I'm going to be as honest as I can. One thing I'll just say though is that there probably is a number of things that I'm not going to be able to answer, and the reason for that is that there's a few things that are still being decided or still being discussed, and I'll just be honest about that, and I'll let you know what is being discussed and all that sort of stuff. And I'd rather do that than speculate. So what I won't do here, I suppose, is kind of speculate as to what the future might hold or whatever it might be. That said, what I can tell you is what I will be able to tell you is linked to kind of what some of the thinking or some of the approaches that are being discussed are involved. So I can do that. And then I suppose the final bit really is just to stress that your questions and the things you ask are really important to me. And a big part of why I'm here is to do some listening and hear a bit about kind of your thoughts and observations. And obviously a webinar and using the chat box may not suffice. So I would genuinely kind of offer to anybody that either by all means drop me a line or give me a call, and I'll more than happily pick some of these conversations up on an individual basis. So starting point is what I was going to do is I just sort of start by kind of going through the questions that had already been sent through as a starting point, and going through those individually, and then if any other questions come in relation to anything that I'm talking about, then I'll pick those up as we go through the chat with Lee's help. So the starting point was, the first question that I have here is, what's Stuart's vision for how he sees coaching at this time next year, and can CSPs still be at the heart of coaching? I suppose a few things to say here. People may or may not know that we at Sports England have a new director of workforce, Caroline Fraser, who started with us 13 days ago. And Caroline's joined us from a really strong human resources and learning and development background in commerce and also within the NHS. And she's got loads of experience around people development, which is brilliant. But she's very new to sport, so she's kind of a big learning process at the moment. But the good news about that is that Caroline essentially heads up the Workforce Directorate at Sport England. So first time there's been a Workforce Directorate, and what this does is it allows us to have a strong voice around workforce-related, people-related matters at kind of executive level, which is really important in terms of delivering against the strategy and delivering against the various workforce strategies that we currently have. And so when I'm talking about coaching here, I'm partially talking about coaching, but I'm also talking about workforce holistically, because obviously coaching is a really important and a very, I would say this, a strong element of workforce, but coaching is a part of workforce. So I'm trying as much as possible
haven't been playing that well.
Sort of independently about coaching itself and talking more broadly about workforce. So if you ask me what my vision of how I see coaching is this time next year, I see it as part of a really strong workforce offer. And in relation to the second part of the question around CSPs being at the heart of coaching, I certainly see CSPs being at the heart of workforce. What I mean by that is when I was writing the coaching plan, firmly in my mind was the idea of CSPs playing a significant role in ensuring that we can deliver our coaching and workforce aspirations at a local level. And the reason why that for me is so important is because of the complexity of the challenge that's in front of us. Given that we're now working, with a more diverse group of people, we're trying to recruit them into coaching workforce roles. We're trying to deploy them. We're trying to support them, and we're doing all those things. The problem you have with that is that the context makes a big difference in terms of the methods that you might adopt. And so a local ability to be able to do that is essential. Can't be done on a national level. We've tried that before. It just doesn't really work. So local and flexible local delivery was very, very central in my mind in terms of how we would be able to implement the plan. And so in terms of the kind of being at the heart, certainly my view there would be that CSPs would be central and have always been central to my thinking around how we might implement the plan. In terms of how that would look then, or if you like, what my vision is for next year or this time next year would be that that there's a really strong infrastructure capable of supporting our workforce needs at the local level, and you won't be surprised to hear that I'm 100% convinced, and I don't know, Caroline supports this view, that the people element of what we try to deliver, both nationally and locally, is critical. And I think what I hope to see is that that workforce element has a much more prominent feature within the kind of range of activities that we will be delivering locally. At the moment, I think it's probably fair to say, both nationally and locally, that in some cases workforce is an add-on, and I'm hoping that by this time next year that workforce would be very much this embedded enabler that is one of the important ingredients to successful delivery of all of our different participation activities. So that's I suppose my short answer to, or it's not a short answer, it's a long answer to that. The next question is, if Stuart was a coaching lead over the next 6 months and likely to be leaving, what would he be focused on during this period? So I just want to take that question in a couple of parts. So the first bit is this issue of likely to be leaving. If the question came in and it's based on the idea that that individual is likely to be leaving, then fine. But if it's based on this idea or a suggestion that that the coaching lead or the coaching leads are no more, if you like, then that's something that I want to address slightly. The reason I say that is we made a communication to all the CSPs around the future funding, and one of the things that we said was that the funding as we currently do it was going to cease. And I think some people have assumed that that meant there's not going to be any funding, and certainly one of the later questions touches on this as well. And that isn't the case. Funding associated with workforce and coaching is there. It's ring-fenced and will be made available to support the implementation of what we're trying to do. What is going to change is the way it's done currently. Most of you will be all too painfully aware that we have almost like a separate process for accessing the coaching funding. There's a different reporting stream. There's there's a different application process. There's an element of duplication. And so one of the things we're looking at is, well, actually, this needs to be a lot more joined up, and it should be part of. If it stays as it is, it will always be seen as a separate entity. If it's part of and locked into the primary role, and also the focus for how it's accessed, how it reports against everything else, is linked to the overall business of a CSP, then that's a more important, a better way of us moving things forward. So the communication was more focused around the way the funding is going to be allocated, rather than or the way the funding will be provided, rather than the methodology, rather than whether funding was going to exist. And the other thing about that as well is that, as you'll all be aware, for the past however many years, 7 years or so, that funding has been, a flat 40k across all of the different CFPs, with the exception of sort of London. And it's that whole idea of a flat award that we're currently reviewing as to if that is the best way for us to utilise that investment, or there are other ways in which we can do it. And so the flat allocation of 40k across won't continue. But again, that's not to say that there won't be funding available to support this implementation. That's definitely going to be there. So the second part of the question, around what would I be focused on during this period? I always am a big believer in one of the New Zealand All Blacks mantras, which is that our job is to make things better than they were before. So if it was me and I'd spent the last 2 years or so, 18 months or so, doing loads of really innovative and challenging and risky work with new communities, and I found out a whole load of things, I would be wanting to document as much of that as possible. I'd want to document it in as comprehensive a way as possible. I would want to lock all that information into the strategic framework that we've asked to be produced. And the reason for that is that I think one of the great legacies of this piece of work, which essentially was a learning investment, would be for all of that learning to be enshrined within some documentation locally, and for that learning then to shape, coupled with the coaching plan nationally, for that learning to shape a strategic document or strategic implementation plan that essentially governs the way coaching, and for that matter workforce, will be tackled by the CSP going forward. And the reason that's really important is because that piece of work and that I guess insight-led sort of strategic document will set the CSP up to be in a really good place to then meet those workforce aspirations, as I mentioned earlier, that are going to be required in the future. So that would be my focus. I'd be wanting to make sure that that we were in as good a place as possible, so that all of that work isn't lost, and all of that rich insight and learning doesn't go to waste. The third question is, who is conducting the independent review of coaching, and what is the message to coaching leads during this review? So we've begun some exploratory conversations with a social enterprise called My Fastest Mile. They specialise in, through an association they have with Bangor University, they specialise in tackling complex problems and uncovering qualitative learning and getting understanding of what a disparate range of activities is telling us. They use a sort of electronic tool called SenseMaker, which was developed through Bangor, which helps people to tell their stories, and they've got a very innovative approach to this. So in keeping with the innovative nature of this investment, we're proposing to use a fairly innovative approach to evaluation, which is, I've had some conversations with research teams at Sport England and also at UK Coaching about this, around looking at what are all the stories that are emerging from all the work that we've done, and then how can we make sense of all those stories? What are the coherent narratives that are emerging from that, so that we can then embed that learning into our future activities. So we're working with them. Like I said, it's at the early stages. We haven't signed any deals yet. We're waiting for the proposals to come through, and it may well be that we look at some alternative evaluation agencies. One of the reasons we're looking at this particular agency is because of their expertise in coaching, and they've been using this similar tool with Sport Wales at the moment with some success. So we feel there's some value in taking this approach, and we'd be very interested to see how it emerges. And the message to coaching leads during this review, which is just to help, be as helpful as possible, be as open as possible, as I always said before, be as honest as possible. I've said all along, it's probably more important that you tell us the challenges than if what worked. I'm very keen that we're not going to be evaluating the work. We're not going to be evaluating impact, because that's not what this investment was originally established for. What we're going to do is we're going to be evaluating what we've learned, and we really need to hear everything. And the aim of this, as much as is humanly possible within the time frame, would be to hear from you, hear from some of the participants, and to hear from some of the coaches, so that we can start to triangulate some of the experiences and start to infer and start to make some links between what's been said and see how the narratives are emerging, and start to compare between different areas. The fourth question is, how do you see the link between primary role application and coaching transition? This is a difficult one for me to answer at the moment. I think I alluded to it earlier, in the sense that at the moment, the coaching transition money, I think you're talking about at the moment, the investment there. The link between the two is we do have a degree of separation at the moment. So this transition money that we're going through now, this next 6 months, is really about galvanizing and harmonizing all of the information that you have to be able to put it into the strategic documentation. But we are, as we move forward, working now closely with the CSP team to ensure that workforce has the right role, has the right prominence within the primary role. So I guess it's a bit of a watch this space. I can't really tell you anything more than that, because it's a piece of work we're doing at the moment. the other question is then, what could CSPs be getting ready for coaching-wise in April 2018? Well, I think that pretty much is all written down in the coaching plan. So if I just take the sort of areas that we're working on, is we want to increase diversity. We want to change the way coaching is perceived. We want to change the way the culture of coaching, and we want to create better experiences for participants. And actually, probably more importantly, we want to reduce poor experiences. So, and the way we're going to tackle that is through our 5 strategic approaches, which is a move away from courses, CPD, kind of knowledge-based training offer, towards much more of a localized support, mentoring, coach development, in situ learning, and helping people kind of in their space. Some of which might be done through technology, some of it might be done face to face. So for me, I think it would be about starting to consider how people, how you can find and identify and support the right people to help others on the ground. So developing that kind of workforce, I think, will be a really important element as far as that's concerned. So if I was going to suggest any focal points, it would be in that direction, and kind of really interrogate the coaching plan from that perspective, because it's sort of pretty clear about the direction of travel, if you like, or it should be. So then the next question is, what is the purpose of the review, as the decision seems to have already been made that funding will not be awarded to CSPs after March? This is this goes back to what I was saying earlier on. I think that's that assumption is an incorrect assumption. The purpose of the review is to determine what we've learned, and the review is to also determine what are the key themes that are emerging that we can then use to help us to develop the next phase of our activities. We've been in the learning phase for the last 18 months, and the next 4 years of our strategy are very much about learning. And with this particular challenge, I don't think it's going to be, you're going to see this kind of, right, we know this now, so we've got to do it this way. I think what we're going to say is that we're going to use the insight that we glean to help us to make sort of continuous improvement to what we're trying to do. And the likelihood is that we won't just do this review once. We will continue to do this review on an annual basis, so that we can sort of begin to correlate what we're learning, check, I suppose, against our own biases, confirmation biases. That we tend to see what we think we see, and use this review to check, give us, I suppose, a reality check as to what's actually happening out there, and then to help us to kind of continuously sort of be quite agile and change the way we work as we move forward, and also benefit from the good stuff. If there's good stuff happening in a couple of areas, and we know that could be translated into other areas, then obviously we want to share that information as much as we possibly can. So that's the purpose of the review. But this decision seems to be already taken that funding will not be awarded. Again, that's not the case. And in actual fact, nothing could be further from the truth, because funding is already allocated to CSPs. It's just how that funding will be utilised and what it will be utilised for. And in actual fact, the review will definitely shape that. The review will shape how that funding should be allocated, what it should be allocated to, what the criteria are for accessing it. And that's another reason I go back to the point earlier about those sort of strategic plans, because the local insight that you have gained is invaluable, and the quality of that insight in then shaping what you propose to do in the future to support workforce requirements will go an awful long way to I guess making a case for further investment. And I'm not just talking about individual CSPs in a competitive scenario. I'm talking about the entire the entire network of all of the CSPs. So I can't stress enough how important it is for everybody to really do as good a job as possible in creating those sort of strategic documents and gathering that insight. Because if we had a network of 45 really high quality documents, then that'd be a fantastic situation for us to be in, and then would give other key decision makers within Sport England an awful degree, a really good degree of confidence that further investment into CSPs around workforce and coaching would be a really valuable proposition. And then the final question I have here is, will CSPs be challenged by Sport England on workforce and or coaching as part of the new primary role? And the answer is yes. I'm totally honest. To be totally honest with you, I'm talking with the CSP team. Hannah and I are on an almost daily basis, and we're working through this at the moment as to what that looks like. But look, CSPs are playing a really important, as part of the primary role, going to be playing a really important strategic enabling role locally, and workforce is a really important enabler to our strategy nationally. So therefore, if our national strategy translates locally, workforce really is going to be incredible. If you hear the insight coming back to us from all of these different activities we've invested in the last few years, people always come back as being really important. So how we can either get more of those types of people, or we can help to develop more of those types of people, is going to be a really critical component of our success going forward with the activity that we're undertaking. And I would argue that if primary role, if the primary applications came in, start coming in, and a really strong consideration to workforce hasn't been given, there'd be some. I would definitely be raising some eyebrows as if to say, well, how are you going to do any of this? So that's going to be a really important part of what we're trying to do here with this. So embedding it within the primary role, making it feature within reporting and all those sorts of things is something we're actively working on at the moment. Right, they're the 7 questions that we had submitted previously. I imagine there's a few others who've come through. So Lee, do you want to kind of be the curator?
Yeah, sorry, Stuart, just unmuting myself. Yeah, there is a couple of questions. A couple that should hopefully be quick ones. One was just to clarify the name of the potential organisation leading the review. Was it My Fastest Mile? Can you just clarify that for us, Stuart?
Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah, okay. Just as well, Stuart, you said you made a comment, funding has already been allocated to CSPs. Could you just clarify, are you referring there to the primary role funding rather than the additional 2 million traditional coaching funding that's traditionally been set aside?
No, I'm referring to the traditional 2 million. The 2 million is still there, and it's being it's kind of it's been identified in next year's budget, if you like. So and it may be more than 2 million. I'm hoping it's all part of a bigger workforce budget, but there's definitely £2 million allocated towards at the moment coaching, but potentially in the future workforce for to go forward. Yeah, it's there.
So will that be an open application similar to, for example, the volunteering funding pots for other organisations, or will it only be open to CSPs?
I don't know. I don't know that. In my mind, it will be an open fund. We wouldn't want to do something like that. It would be focused on CSPs. But again, that's not entirely my decision, but that's just my thinking. So it wouldn't be an open fund. It'd be done in that way. And the question we currently have is just how. I mean, there's a question coming here about how the 2 million might be allocated. That's a question I can't answer either. because there's a number of different ways that could be allocated. So we're still working on that, but you'll hear from us in short order around some proposals related to that.
Okay, thank you. There are one or two others, but we might have answered those. Sally, there was a comment and a question from you. I think we may have covered it in those answers. If not, please tell me via the chat box, and we'll ask Stuart to answer. But I think we may have covered in what we've just said. We've had a question from Sue. Okay, a question from Sue here to you, Stuart. Do you envision coaching lead roles to still exist, or would you see it being split upon the whole team?
So that's not really a decision for me. That's going to be a decision for each CSP and each director to work out. My view on it, my opinion, if you like, is I definitely want, or I would be keen to see expertise in coaching and workforce retained within the CSPs, because I would question how well we can, or how well a CSP would be able to deliver on its workforce requirements if it didn't have expertise. Do I envision coaching lead roles to still exist? As in, do I see coaching lead roles in terms of delivery roles? Then I'd probably say no. And the reason I say that is because, as you're all aware, CSPs are being asked to play a more strategic enabling role. And so kind of the delivery side of things is less within the thinking. Now, having said all that, that's not to say that if an organisation, or if a CSP was to say, well, look, our local insight and the work we've done so far and our strategic plan is basically saying that actually having delivery capability is important, then fine, that'd be an interesting case to make. I think the one thing to say though is that Sporting and across the piece in all of its investments, and some of you will be aware of investments made into governing bodies recently, where there's a move away from funding, kind of roles, and a move towards funding activity. So, as a general rule, what we would want to be seeing is to see the funding going towards the activity. Now, my ideal scenario here, though, going back to what I said earlier about expertise, is I would hope that directors, CSP directors, will understand that workforce is going to be a really important component of what they're trying, will help with the success factors of what they're trying to deliver from a participation standpoint. And as a result, having that workforce expertise is going to be really important. So again, this is where I come back to, each of the coaching leads to use we've sort of been a little bit ahead of the game here, and to take that high quality learning and insight from what we've done, put it into a package, and then that helps to galvanise the CSP in terms of its future direction around workforce. So it's a bit of a mixed answer, that one, I'm afraid, but hopefully that's given you a little bit of clarity around sort of the future direction.
Okay, thank you. Just working down the questions now that we've had through. Nat has asked how the 2 million will be allocated, but I think we've covered that. Again, if not, Nat, if there's anything in particular, then let us know. One, you might have an opinion or an answer to this, Stuart, although you have said decisions are still to be made around the allocation of the funding. But just a question from Jean, and will population be considered in terms of funding allocation?
Again, difficult for me to answer. That's currently, there is a bit of a precedent set as far as that's concerned, in terms of, where, for example, major conurbations, like London, obviously get a slightly different allocation. But possibly is the answer. Again, it may not be based on a sort of allocation as such. It may be based around, the kind of identified needs that have come through within the local strategies and through the insight. So it might be based more on a qualitative understanding of the activity that's going to be undertaken, as opposed to a purely quantitative analysis. It could be, it could be a CSP that's very dense in population, but hasn't really articulated its kind of workforce needs particularly well, in which case, how would you be able to make a strong investment decision as far as that's concerned? I am actually now beginning to speculate slightly, so I'll probably need to shut up. But that's if you know what I mean, that's what I'm saying. These are things that we're still considering.
Okay, yeah, I understand that. Thank you. Just a question again on the funding, but will this be on an annual basis or longer term, i.e. over 4 years?
I don't know. And the one thing I'd say is that I want to, as much as possible, work on a longer term basis, because I don't believe that this short term approach is particularly beneficial to anybody. So I would like to create a funding stream that works longer. That's something that I need to work through with other colleagues as well. So it's, again, there's something we'll let you know. But my aspiration would be longer term.
Okay, thank you. Question from Nat. What directive will be provided in the primary role function in relation to workforce / coaching development?
I don't know. I don't know if it will be a directive. That's something that I'm working on at the moment. However, I think the one thing that will be very much the case will be a question around how are you going to do this, and how are you going to ensure high quality, and how are you going to ensure that the best people are in place? How are you going to make sure that if people come along to sessions, that there isn't some maniac doing boot camp stuff when all they want is an arm around the shoulder? These are the sorts of questions that I'd want to, I'd ask any organisation coming to us now. I mean, in actual fact, with our core market applications, these are questions I've posed. So the Workforce Directorate now is beginning to sort of, I suppose, ask more of those questions of the organisation. I'd like to say, I'd say we'd probably avoid a directive, but there'll be, I guess, some guidance, and that will be largely created through what we hear from the evaluation. So the story that emerges, the narrative that emerges from that evaluation, will guide, I think, quite strongly what we do going forward. So if you want to describe that as a directive, that's as close as you're going to get.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from Michelle. I think it's built on the point that you made, Stuart, around delivery versus the more strategic role with workforce and coaching. So the question Michelle has asked is, do you want CSPs to stop delivering coaching projects, even if our evidence and insight demonstrate that it is effective?
No. Particularly if the site demonstrates they're effective, and I'd like to think that would come through in the evaluation. So no, but I suppose the question we have to ask ourselves is, in this changing landscape, where we're all being asked to have greater impact with either the same or less money, are there other ways in which we can do what we're doing? Are there better ways? And that's the continuous improvement methodology. So my question would be a couple of questions there, which is, no, definitely don't want to stop. If we're having an impact and we're being effective, then definitely don't stop. But I would also then ask the question back, which is, how are you comparing effectiveness? How's that compared? What's that compared against? How do you know effective couldn't be more effective in a different way? So I'm just, these are just questions I would pose, and I'm hoping that those questions are going to come out in the evaluation. I think it's a challenge we have a lot in a lot of what we do is, we see an effect. It doesn't necessarily mean things are effective. And so only by comparing against either a control group or others doing similar work can we begin to understand whether our work is genuinely effective or not. Anyway, so long story short, no, don't stop delivering coaching projects. But maybe let's just start thinking about whether we can ramp up what we're doing by being smarter.
Okay, thanks, Stuart. Another question's just come in. It's from Louisa, and it says, as the CSP primary role application is due to be submitted in October, are you just looking for headlines for the approach for workforce, as these dates don't match up with the independent evaluation?
Thanks, Louisa. That's a good one. I wouldn't say that, because you have your own insight. The evaluation is about trying to harvest all of the learning that's taken place across all of the CSPs so that we can create a kind of compelling national narrative. And obviously that's going to tell us lots, and it's going to guide a bit of what we're going to do going forward. But from a principles perspective, and from a so you've got let's just take coaching, right? You've got a coaching plan, which is providing, I suppose, a framework or a blueprint around what we want to try and achieve and how we want to do it. You've got local insight. That's you kind of road tested the coaching plan before the coaching plan came out, really, the principles of the coaching plan anyway. And you've learned from that, and I'd really be keen to see some of that really strong insight coming out as much as possible into those primary role applications, largely because for most of us here who are working in coaching or people development workforce, I think we would strongly believe that work has added significant value to work that we would want to do within or can add significant value to work we want to do within the primary role. So if anything, I would say the opposite. I'd say I'd like to try and see as much detail as possible in those applications, so that make your case and show the value of workforce in those applications. I do know that some CSPs, for example, their entire kind of strategy is very workforce driven, and so I'd be interested to see that. So I wouldn't think about the independent evaluation as sort of saying, again, it's not going to be a directive. It's just going to help to guide our future direction.
Okay, thanks, Stuart. Okay, yeah, just a comment there from Louisa. There's no more questions that have come in via the chat box, so hang on, spoke too soon. From Linda Gain. When will you know workforce will be part of the primary role of CSPs or not, as the case may be?
It definitely is. It is part of the primary role. The thing for me at the moment is it's one of a number of different things, and I think what we have to get internally within Sporting we need to get clear, and I think externally as well within is that it's not one on a list of things. It's a thing that is going to support all of the other things, or many of the other things. So it's definitely there. It's just a question of surfacing it in the right way.
Okay, thank you. Just a question I've had come through privately as well. Is this going to be in the guidance notes which CSP should receive next week with regard to that primary role application? So what you've just said, Stuart, will that be communicated in the guidance notes?
Workforce.
Yeah, that kind of message you've just given around workforce being a definite factor and definite important element of the primary role for CSPs. Will those comms be going out to CSPs and as part of that primary role application paperwork?
What I know is that workforce is definitely within the primary role. What I don't know is whether there's any workforce guidance being given within the guidance documentation that's going out. I suppose that's what I'm assuming. So I will check.
Okay, thanks, Stuart. We just had a question. Someone just missed a little bit. If you wouldn't mind, just briefly, Stuart, because I know you've covered this already, but just briefly, could you just go over again the independent evaluation that's being conducted? Is this for the coaching work? Is this for the coaching work of the CSP in general?
It's not. No. Well, it's more focused on the 4 service areas that we've worked on. So it's more focused on kind of evaluating what we've learned from the last 18 months of investment. However, if there's other general coaching work that should be included within that, we're not going to lock it down to just that. So, I mean, I suppose priority